best practices. So the situation, differs in every square, whatever, centimeter. And not only the practices that work for farmers, are quite localized. The farmers themselves have very unique characteristics. Their farm families have unique characteristics, markets, etc. So we are talking about questions that farm households might have on those practices, on how to expand and how to improve them using digital tools. And obviously we also have digital tools and digital providers who might want to, who are looking for providing scientific information to support those farm households. And so I think it's a very interesting area. It's, narrow a little bit down, not focusing on any type of agriculture system, but on some systems that are, taking sustainability and resilience a little bit more serious. Anyway, that is the topic of this last panel of this exciting conference today. And to kick us off, we actually have two panelists who will discuss those questions with you, because I don't think they'll have all the answers, but they have, I think, lots of great ideas. And the first of our panelists is John de la Parra. I forgot to ask you how to pronounce your name. He's the director of the global food portfolio at the Rockefeller Foundation, where he works to advance a more nourishing and sustainable food system. So it's always good to bring nutrition and food and agricultural production together. And he specifically, according to my information, works on two core programs. One is the Food System Vision Prize, and the other one, the Periodic Table of Food. And he has a background, which I also find exciting or very interesting, in ethnobotany and plant chemistry. And our second panelist is David Bergvinson. He's currently the senior advisor to DevGlobal and the founder of BeSustainable.io, where he focuses on delivering science-based solutions to empower farmers, exactly what we're talking about. In his previous positions, there were many, but he was, among others, the DG of ICTforAg. And also he was working at the Gates Foundation, where he initiated work on digital agriculture. So again, hard to see how we could have two better panelists here. And David's training has been in plant biochemistry. And he also has a master's in integrated pest management, which I find again very applicable here, in agriculture and forestry as well. So yeah, please give a hand to our two excellent and perfectly positioned panelists for this last panel. And to kick this discussion off, David has volunteered to present a few slides, that just give a bit of an overview and background on what we're talking about, hyper-localized agroecological and sustainable practices. And hopefully they come up here on the slide. And I think I'll stop.
All right. Well, thank you, Claudia, and thank you to the organizers for this opportunity. Very exciting to see this particular topic, because it was actually the genesis of our work in the Gates Foundation back in 2011 of how do we use ICT technology to actually empower smallholder farmers to make wise decisions to increase their profitability and resilience. So thank you for this. There are, when the topic was first broached, it was around sustainable agriculture, and under that, you can read the definition there from USDA, but basically it's protecting the environment and the natural resources while we produce nutritious food. Under that, though, there are many different frameworks that have overlapping practices, and I thought it was just sort of good to lay some of them out. This is by no means an exhaustive list. Starting off with conservation agriculture, many years ago, whose objective or main outcome was to conserve the soil through reduced or zero tillage practices. We had sustainable intensification, and the CGIAR has programs in that area as well, looking at optimizing productivity on existing land with positive environmental and social impacts. So you see a common theme running through them. Agroecological intensification, here more embracing of natural processes, including social and cultural perspectives, which I think has come up in their conversations today. Agroforestry, where you're looking at a system and increasing biodiversity through the integration of trees and shrubs. Regenerative agriculture, which is the one I've been more engaged with more recently, around improving soil health through various practices common to the the topics above, but specifically reduced or no tillage, cover crops, crop rotations, and livestock integration, among others. Common to all of these, though, is the general goal to feed an increasing population without negative environmental or social consequences. But they have different outcome emphases, and that's basically what differentiates them. So when I was thinking about, I'll use the regenerative agriculture example, given it's a little bit more familiar, but I think it extends to any of those frameworks for sustainable for sustainable farming. And it was brought up, you know, in this morning's conversation. Keep the end in mind. What is it you want to achieve? Who you want to serve, and how? And that's really important, because we have all this great technology, but sometimes it's just not a good fit for the solution farmers are looking for. Human-centered design. This is an iterative process, and we need to engage farmers and other stakeholders in the design of these solutions to make sure that they enjoy widespread adoption in a sustainable manner. Part of that is the ownership process and policy making to create the enabling environment, but also the ownership is very important in many of the projects that I've been involved with, including engaging with heads of state. The process of getting ownership is really important, because that's what's going to sustain these efforts after a project ends. ICT, yes, but also artificial intelligence was a very strong theme today. But human knowledge also integrated into that to ensure that we have localized services. Aligning incentives along the value chain. I think this is very important for sustainability. We heard a little bit about the private sector partners, creating the demand for sustainable farming practices and how ICT can enable that. And underlying all of this is this public data infrastructure, the supporting data that allows us to unlock a lot of these tailored services. So we get to hyper-local. We're talking about high-resolution soil maps, weather data, hydrology, infrastructure, market pricing, and you can add to that list. Oh, actually, I don't know how we go back. Oh, you can go back. So there's three, if you do a little bit of a Venn diagram to this, you have sort of the social components, which include this whole issue of process and ownership by farmers all the way up to heads of state. The systems that support this could be, the data systems, but there are other systems in play here. And of course, the science. The overlap of these three is really what I feel is going to enable us to realize the agri-food system transformation that we so desperately need to respond to the many challenges we face in our current food system. The market pull for regenerative agriculture or sustainable farming is very important. Rockefeller has invested in and enabled an ecosystem of partners under Regen 10 to build a coalition of public and commercial partners to provide data, track outcomes, networking, in order to scale regenerative agriculture practices globally. But this is not new. General Mills already was moving in this direction back in 2018, amongst many other progressive private sector partners. And, the big pivot basically outlines here in this picture, working with nature, protecting the soil, increasing biodiversity above and below the soil, and a holistic approach to farming. So localized knowledge services, there's three examples that I'm very familiar with, but there are so many that have been presented at the meeting already. Weather-based advisory services. Agriculture is a weather-driven sector, and unfortunately, smallholder farmers have limited access to localized, accurate weather data to make informed agronomy decisions. And so, in partnership with Colro, Tomorrow.now is developing a weather-based advisory service, which now I believe has around 1 million farmers accessing the resource. The second example is innovation hubs. This is an area that when I was at ICRISAT, we were very invested in bringing scientists together with entrepreneurs and other private sector actors to scale science-based innovation. It was good for the scientists because they got the perspective of a business of what was needed to make a solution sustainable. And it was good for the businesses because they could tap into the CGI excellence. Examples of this included Plantex's AI-based image recognition system, started in 2015 and now is very mature in helping identify, using mobile phones, pests and disease, as well as the recommendations to control them. Then we have examples like Digital Green, where you're using ICT, but engaging stakeholders in the development and delivery of that knowledge and services, which really feeds into the human-centered design of solutions to make them sustainable and to have ownership within the community. So hats off to Digital Green. But when we talk about sustainable farming or regenerative agriculture practices, we do really need location-specific recommendations to deliver solutions that are going to lead to this transformation. This is particularly true of soil and weather, but also market information. Markets are very important in driving farmers' decisions. Another component is blockchain traceability for certification of regenerative agriculture. There could be a premium in the marketplace, especially early on, and so you need to build the trust network that farmers that are producing produce using regenerative practices do get a market premium to incentivize that behavior and practice. And earth observation can actually be used to monitor all of these practices, but especially regenerative agriculture given zero tillage, in order to help validate and distribute carbon credits once those systems are mature. So just to wrap up, knowledge exchange, localized, really need to do it better, faster, and cheaper. ICT is an enabler to do that. Foundational data, especially geospatial data, is going to be important. Mainstreaming the use of Earth observation, I think something we've talked a little bit about, but I think there's scope for more. Inclusive innovation processes to ensure solutions are actually accessible to farmers. The inclusion component is very important for sustainability. People, policy, planning, and performance. One of the big things with ICT, we've talked about it a lot, but how do we actually go to scale? And I think, the performance-based metrics, I'm glad to see the Inspire, integrating performance into those awards. So thank you.
Perfect. Yeah. So now we have already heard not only what we're talking about, but also a whole bunch of examples already on how we can link digital solutions and digital tools with sustainable agriculture, whatever it means, and whatever you think it could be or should be. So I think let's move over to John now, and just to hear from you what have you heard, or what do you think farmers are actually looking for? Like what kinds of information that we could provide with digital tools? We heard a lot of examples already from David on weather, etc. So what maybe you could add to that, and then maybe one or two examples from Rockefeller Foundation, or how you're trying to overcome this hyper localized.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much. So I think there's a couple ways that we've been interfacing this. I'll say the foundation, Rockefeller Foundation, hasn't focused as much on ICT solutions in particular, but I think there are a couple interfaces that have been really useful for us to find a niche that could be powerful. One general area is in learning broadly. So we have partnered with Digital Green, as was mentioned previously, on an AI chatbot that is being deployed in India, in northern India. And when we look at this, the question becomes, well, where are these data coming from? How are they being curated? And how involved is the local community in any of those processes? Up to now, you use ChatGPT, which is actually most of what extension agents have been using. They're getting these data from who knows where. In fact, it's a black box, right, with ChatGPT in particular and OpenAI. What we have developed with Digital Green is that when they're going into a specific location, they form partnerships with local government and local organizations and farmers to understand what are the needs and the governance that they would like to have around something like this. Part of that is the development of golden questions, so specific questions developed around sustainable agriculture, regenerative agriculture, because we know, of course, there's going to be a bias in the data. Most of the agricultural research that has been done is with conventional agriculture, so when you ask ChatGPT a question, it's going to give you an answer that comes from those data. So it's really helpful to have specificity around that. The other part around learning and education that we have done is through a project called Food EDU, which is an effort to develop online modules for training, and this actually covers regenerative agriculture, it covers food composition data, which I'll talk about in a minute. And it's a broad online platform that also has Good Food Fellows, they're called, which are Global South fellowships that really get specific around community empowered learning. So any project that's proposed to go through the Good Food Fellows has to be developed with the community in mind. It can't just be kind of a top-down question that comes from us. It must kind of emanate from the community itself, and we really center that when we talk about those. And then, you know, we think that the ICT tools actually allow us for a greater degree of specificity. I mentioned food composition data, and you mentioned the Periodic Table of Food Initiative. So for the past 4 years or so, I've been leading a project called the Periodic Table of Food Initiative, PTFI, and we just launched at the end of last month. In that effort, we're seeking to develop standardized, comprehensive tools for food composition. That may sound a little dry and boring, but actually we haven't had these specific tools to measure food composition in a universal and standardized way, and now we have developed those for the first time. How does that connect to this? Well, when you have that information and you also have metadata attached to any particular food item, let's say now you know where the food came from, how it was grown, was it grown regeneratively, or any X number of different particular practices, information about soil health or the microbiome of the soil, you can tag that to any particular food and then measure the composition. And now you suddenly have a database that can tell you real information about whether food that's grown regeneratively versus conventionally is better for people and planet. Is it actually changing the nutritional density of those foods? So that allows us to be climate specific, it allows us to be geographically specific, and it also allows us to be practice specific. And those are all powered through our 9 centers of excellence around the world, 7 of which are in the Global South. And as I mentioned, those questions are being developed by those institutions themselves. So it's very localized in the communities. And finally, another area that we've been working in is looking at existing data sets. So for instance, one project we're working on with CIMMYT is with the Mass Agro data set, which includes decades of data, some of which has never been fully analyzed, some of which certainly hasn't been subjected to AI analysis and more complex and comprehensive analyses. So we've developed now a list of 30 to 50 data sets that exist around the world with agricultural data that could help us answer some of these really pressing questions about regenerative agriculture, but without having to do 10 more years of research. Perhaps there are ways to answer those questions by looking backwards and investing in those existing data sets.
Okay. Oops, excellent. I have a lot of follow-on questions, but we want this to be a discussion. And so rather than asking right away, I'll ask you both a second question, and then we'll already, I think, start the dialogue with our audience, very informed audience. So yeah, my second question simply is, this is all very interesting, very complex. So going, from science to farmers and back, because it's very important to share capacities. And so where do you see CGR's role in that, right? I mean, you all mentioned many partners and you all mentioned CGR already, but, as you know, we're reforming and redeveloping programs. And so there's a digital program and there's sustainable ag programs and agroecological programs all being developed separately. What's your advice on these programs? What should they do if they could only do one thing?
Oh, okay, that's a different question than started.
But it's a new question.
Okay, for me, so actually something we did in early April, I don't know if anyone was there that's in this room, Joe was there. We hosted a convening in Nairobi to help the CG develop a vision for a research agenda around regen/agroecology/ all the names that David had up there. So because we know the CG is doing all types of research throughout the whole of CG that can ladder up into this, but perhaps it would be nice, and it's, we're agnostic to this, but we offered the help. Perhaps it would be nice to bring those together in one place, if it's possible, if everyone can get along. It seemed like everyone did in Nairobi, at least. We know that there are some ideologies and maybe religions associated with these different camps, but I think we came together really well in Nairobi. I think there was a lot of common ground. So if there was one thing around this particular topic. I would love to see a kind of harmonized research agenda vision that could be investable for funders, and it could also project leadership, I think, around the world for what types of questions need to be answered here to actually get a transition moving in a more specific and rapid way.
Okay, thank you. David, the same question to you. The one thing you want CGR to do in these new mega programs in this area. Yeah.
Well, great response, so I can go to something else. Is this working? You know, I think one opportunity as I look at the CG reform process more broadly, not just this topic, is, you know, how do we use data and these tools to bring together and realize the cross-cutting nature of the research the CGR does. Right now it can be a bit fragmented, and so how are we using data systems to better integrate across the different mega programs that are proposed under the new structure? And then how do you use that to better integrate or partner with national partners, be it both public and private sector, in service of realizing country visions or goals or strategies?
Okay, sounds very good, and hopefully people take notes who have to write those programs. So I already want to, you know, hand over to all of you to ask some questions. I'll add mine on as well, but please, you heard a lot of examples of very new, exciting programs, and no, the slide has changed, but anyway, there were a couple on the slide as well. So over to you to ask your questions to those two experts. And one of them is a funder, so could be other interesting questions. Yes, please. And please mention your name as well. I know most of you know each other by now, but just in case.
Sure. I'm Geneviève Lavelle, and I'm the CEO and founder of AgriLedger. I was very interested in, David, in your presentation, because it feels like this is what I've been talking about for a while. And one of the items that I'm still struggling with, even though I've built a blockchain, is how to get the market to accept it. So it's very interesting to me to have you and John here, because I think until we get the acceptance, because what I get as a question, and I really would like to ask your experience, is the scalability. And you can't scale something, you know, and we talk about scalability, but then you'll hear about projects which are using 2,000, 3,000 people. So how do we balance that is my question.
Okay, great. Anything else? Any other question? Or you know everything already? Or you're too tired? Okay, there's one more question, then I add my question and we hand back.
Hi, thank you, John Wall from One Nature Institute. So I think the burning question I have is that there's a lot of different data sets that are out there, and a lot of people conducting research, but in my experience, there's a lot of problem with combining or working across these data sets, because there aren't these standards or dictionaries as Andreas mentioned this morning. What can we do to push for adoption of some standard, some standardization of ways to talk about agriculture that would allow us to allow market information and agronomical information and environmental information, et cetera, to be to interact?
It's a difficult question. But so my questions direct to John. John's examples, you mentioned the golden questions, which sounds very exciting to me. And so I was wondering, you know, to what extent you will indigenous knowledge and indigenous peoples, and also, you know, farmers directly will be allowed to answer those questions, because I think you were also thinking of experts. But I mean, so where do you draw your sample from? And because you mentioned India, we've been working with Self-Employed Women's Association. They have 1.2 million women members, women farmers. They have 2.5 million members, but 1.2 million are women farmers. and trying this out, I think, with women farmers, and they like to listen to other women. So this the learning, the AI chatbot, I think that would be an excellent example, and they're very well organized, and so they actually can reach the 1.2 million if you just talk to one person at the top, which is great. On the food EDU example, I was just wondering who measures the composition. My understanding is you have developed those standards that I think the second gentleman was asking about, but is it done by these centers of excellence, or do you also involve again local communities? Thank you. So you have now.
Okay, thank you. So I have four questions. Scalability. That's a great question. I think that there are some very important research questions. I think David will have a better answer than I will, but I'll answer the way that I'm thinking about it. So, when we had this convening in Nairobi, one of the things that was a point of note, I'd say early on, is that someone had shown a figure of the transition pathway for going from conventional to regenerative agroecological practices, and that this takes, maybe, depending, but 5-7 years or something before you see yields and ultimately economic impact increasing. I think, one, we need to do that for many different places, different crops, different situations, because then we have the empirical data that'll help us, show that a transition is possible and what it might cost us to actually do that and what we might benefit from. So that's my limited answer, but I'm sure David has a better one than that. To the standardized data question, I mean, isn't it the hope that with artificial intelligence, we will need this less, right? The fact that we have disparate data sets all around the world. I remember 5-10 years ago, this was a big focus of, okay, we need a standardized way of collecting agricultural data. I think the hope is that with AI now, that we can actually look at disparate data sets and combine them in ways that we can have hopefully a high degree of fidelity that it makes sense. So that's my hope. That's kind of a workaround to that question. At the same time, there are new types of empirical data that we can collect that can be impactful, and that leads to the periodic table of food question and composition. So the reason that we went down this route to develop a food composition initiative, which again, there's the who cares question, right? We already have a certain amount of data on food composition, and we know we can measure certain things in food. But what we typically measure about 150 things in our food, about a maximum in most food composition databases, but we know there are tens of thousands of compounds that are in our foods and that they vary based on many different things that we associate with metadata, like maybe climate change or agricultural practice or processing or storage or all these other things. So developing a standardized way to do that and be much more comprehensive can be very valuable, because now we'll actually know what's in our food and we can tie it to specific scientific questions like how it was grown, for instance. So that's kind of the drive for that type of standardization, and I think that will be really important. And in fact, those data, we've analyzed the first 500 foods that are available on foodperiodictable.org. You can peruse those. There's really nice visualizations associated with them. You can also download the full data sets to see every compound that was detected, even things that aren't named yet. That will be really important for AI, because now we have a whole new set of empirical data that never existed before, and AI can't do anything if there's no existing data to build it from. So now you can do things like tie genetics to composition, et cetera, and all these other things. Okay, and then the golden question. The golden question. So the idea, I think, behind this in the principles of AI is that you have standardized questions that are considered absolutely correct and will influence the way that the model will ultimately answer the questions. So in that case, there may be some, incontrovertible kind of questions that we just need to answer around, that have to do specifically with practices, but that would include traditional ecological knowledge as well, right? So one thing we didn't have listed up there was traditional ecological knowledge, which is the basis for all of this, right? So really the way that indigenous people have done agriculture for 12,000 years was in some ways must have been inherently sustainable, at least for that amount of time. So yes, and in fact, through many of different initiatives that we're working on, we are centering Indigenous voices in the work that we do. I launched the first fully Indigenous-led grant that includes 7 different small Indigenous groups around the world doing what we might call regenerative agriculture, but are actually forms of traditional ecological knowledge, and to answer the questions in their places of how the practices might be done and how they might be scaled, at least in that landscape, right? Scalability is a tough question because there's different landscapes and you have to choose where you're working, and it means you might have to do the same types of experiments in thousands of different places to understand how those translate. So I think it's important to not necessarily invite Indigenous people to the table, but to come to their tables, to go to the places where that work is being done and centering those voices and then empowering that work. Was there another question? Okay. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, so it's sort of a twofold question, traceability and the role of blockchain. And second is getting over the death valley of pilots. You get to a certain scale and then you just can't go further. So I think, ICT enables us on both of those fronts. On blockchain, there are, low energy trust models of blockchain that I think lend themselves to agriculture investments, especially traceability for regeneratively produced products that can be actually validated using Earth observation. So it's, all of this, you have to bring down the cost so they become operational in order for them to be scaled. And then the second, Andre already gave us, the framework for managing agricultural data and getting, that structured in a way that it's accessible to the broader community. I think actually just as important is the incentives and behavior change of actually sharing the data in the first place, which sometimes we overlook, but it's actually really an important impediment to unlocking that integrated data ecosystem.
Okay, thank you. So last round of questions. Anyone has any questions? Otherwise, I will ask more questions. Okay, we have a question here. Oh, sorry. And your name again. No, sorry, behind you.
Andrew Mack, nice to meet you. So I guess my question is about when you were talking about sustainable and regenerative, right? You mentioned the need to try to get a market premium for those enhanced practices. It strikes me that we're stuck in an interim space between a wide enough market premium to make that work, or a large enough market premium, because not everybody's going to be able to become a whole food seller, or legislation, which creates an artificial floor, right? Yet, have you seen any other models that might work to get us there in the short term? Because if 1.5 billion people are in small farm ecosystems around the world, not all of them are going to sell into high value, high wealth markets. Thanks.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I'm sure you have a great answer as well. So one thing I would say is looking at true cost accounting for some of these practices, right? I mean, meaning that we're not just looking at the market price, but we're looking at the systemic impacts of continuing to do agriculture the way that we have done it for the last 50, 60 years. So getting markets to acknowledge a true cost accounting, and in the US, we've had some work in this area looking at legislation, for example, in school feeding. So, in New York State, the apples that are the cheapest are the ones that wind up in schools. But if you actually apply a true cost accounting metric to those apples, you may find that the local apples that have been grown sustainably actually, the true cost is actually lower for the ones that have a higher market cost. So that's one, and then we've also looked at market drivers like school feeding in East Africa has been a big focus of ours. So what if you could convince governments to purchase regeneratively grown food, again, likely based on a true cost accounting principle, you could drive the transition as well, just through through government purchasing for school feeding. That's just one idea, but.
And in fact, yeah, because that gets me into my next question. But let's also see how many more people would like to ask questions before we continue. No, we will continue in this area, but any more questions before? Because I have to fit it in. Well, no, there's no other burning questions.
Well, I just to finish off, that's not the only incentive. Yeah. What we're seeing with farmers actually is resilience. And so these practices actually increase soil carbon. That increases the field holding capacity for water, that then allows farmers to get through periods of drought. It also, with residue management, reduces soil temperatures, which actually can help them get through periods of high temperature as well. So these are not just economic drivers from the perspective of market access, but also agronomic drivers as well.
And that was exactly, leads into this, what are the actual indicators of success, or what are the reasons of why farmers adopt something? Profitability is a big one, but resilience, given we have a completely different agricultural system today than just 10 years ago. I mean, just look at forest fires, look at everything. So the way people have to operate today, it's either a flood or it's a heat stress event or a drought. So this will give a huge boost to practices, and there we actually, I think, have to overcome a huge information gap, because farmers who have not traditionally necessarily used these practices might not be fully aware at this point in time of the resilience enhancing benefit streams from these practices. But I think there's a question of broader, I think I mean, true cost accounting is one methodology, and I know that there's people in the room who have worked on that in various countries. But there are broader, you know, what are broader indicators of success of these farming type systems, and to what extent can we use digital tools to provide information on those broader benefit streams, and to what extent can farm communities or, you know, other beneficiaries, because obviously all consumers benefit, report those back. And we hear the food tables, I think, is one way, because we go beyond the actual regenerative practices to consuming foods, you know, that are generated not necessarily because they have a premium value, but there might be other benefits, you know, in terms of the composition. So we have the true cost accounting piece. So there's a whole bunch of metrics, but I think the question is, do we now know all the metrics? We know the resilience, we know the food composition, but there's obviously still research in both areas. But what other metrics can you think of at this point, and also?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would start by saying, I work with Hopi farmers in Arizona that have been growing maize and beans with no irrigation for thousands of years. They call themselves 100-generation farmers, right? I mean, they've been growing these crops resiliently without collecting data, other than the way that we think about it, right? I mean, there's obviously traditional ways of collecting and analyzing data. And so you know, that's one thing. There might need to be a paradigm shift about the way we're thinking about this, just because if we start to talk to people who have been doing farming with traditional crops for thousands of years, there may be things to learn that we don't know what we can measure and can't measure yet. And that might be through stories, right? It might not be a drone. But also biodiversity. I think metrics around biodiversity are really important, like innovations around eDNA and other stuff are really exciting and interesting. And that might be helpful too, because I think that there are a lot of, again, disparate measurements for biodiversity that run the gamut, but I don't think there's a kind of a universally accepted metric around biodiversity, and that could be helpful, especially when you're validating a regenerative practice and you have some metric on biodiversity.
So one is soil organic carbon as another indicator for this, for the reasons I mentioned earlier. And yes, biodiversity. We don't have to know everything that's there, but we can measure biodiversity. And if we're moving into a more diverse production system, I think it's generally a good indicator for resilience.
To what extent, again, can you use digital tools? How are they being used, both from farmers upwards, farmer families and communities, and downwards? I mean, are there?
So I come back to Earth observation.
Examples?
That, you know, this is a very powerful tool. It's getting more powerful. If it has, coupled with good ground validation, can be very helpful in reducing the cost of evaluating longitudinally the impact of these interventions. And you know, to your point about data integration, this is a huge opportunity, one that we're still struggling with, of how do we integrate the wealth of household surveys and other geospatial data with remote sensing data to get at tracking our performances on a global food system.
Okay. Do you have any other I mean, especially based on your background, ethnobotany and so forth, in terms of how digital tools can be applied to enrich, the data systems around regenerative
Well, I might
farming?
flip it around a little, because I actually think we need to be sensitive around how we collect data from indigenous communities. And we've done a lot of work in the past couple of years. I've done work on digital sequence information, DSI issue. Maybe some of you are familiar with the Nagoya Protocol and the fact that Nagoya regulates how we share biological resources, physical biological resources around the world, but it doesn't address directly the digital information that's attached to those biological resources. So for the past few years, we've worked with a number of traditional indigenous communities and corporations, because this is a big problem, and I think it's a big coming problem as well that we should all be more aware of. That there will be an imperative coming. I think in the biodiversity COP in Colombia this year, we expect that there will be an agreement around how DSI will be shared coming forward. So I think there's a tremendous amount of information that we can collect and tie to ways that indigenous people are doing agriculture. My warning is that we should be careful about how we're collecting that, and we should make sure that we're doing it in ways that are respectful of that traditional knowledge and aren't being exploitative, which has been the history of how we've collected and shared that information. With the periodic table of food, we've gotten ahead of this issue immediately, and the way that we've done that is when we work with indigenous communities on their foods that are culturally or spiritually important, we allow them to fully analyze those foods, but keep it in a sequestered database for their own usage, right? It doesn't have to go into the main database so a corporation can pull it up and use it in any way possible, because, well, the US is not a signatory to Nagoya, first off, but also just, there's so many ways it could be exploited. So I would just be careful about any information that we collect.
But that was exactly my question on who's involved in measuring the food composition and owning that. So that's great that you already have standards in place, and very good that this will come up at the CBD COP. And then again, to what extent can it feed back and enrich regenerative farming? I think that's really great. So I guess next time we need a session at the ICT conference on indigenous digital systems that enrich, support, empower indigenous communities as well. Okay.
Yeah, there's some tremendous thinkers there you could tap into.
Yeah, that's good. And it sounds like, we know who's going to manage that session, put it together. So I think this is really great. And I think we've scratched the surface, I would say, but it's obviously an area with a lot of interesting questions that have yet to be answered. And maybe just I'll ask another question to my panel that was not prepared. And that question simply is, in terms of research question, there's so many, and we've just, as I said, scratched the surface on a couple: traceability, standardization, localization, community ownership of information. So again, between this year and next year, and obviously 1 year is usually not enough when we talk about anything regenerative, but what are the 1 or 2 research questions? We also talked about indicators, that maybe should be prioritized. I mean, you already gave some ideas what the mega programs should be doing, but in terms of research question, what would you prioritize, 1 or 2, to close us out? Thank you.
I would focus on the science of scaling solutions. I think we need to work with a sense of urgency to get innovation into the fields of farmers so that our food system is both resilient, nutritious, but also delivering economic benefits for rural communities.
Okay. So the question is, how can we scale the best, the fastest?
Yeah. So when I was a CG scientist, I was always looking at ways of overlapping processes to compress time to impact. And so that's the challenge to the CG. How do you compress time to impact?
For me, I was mentioning to you both, I was thinking about this when we had this convening in Nairobi. We wanted a research agenda to come out of there that would be robust and vetted, and we had some great ideas. Actually, it was so many ideas. We're still synthesizing that, even though we're a month from when the convening happened. Before I came to that convening, I had developed kind of a mock-up research agenda for, like, what are the things that we should be asking. I came at it from the view of a skeptic. Not that I myself am a skeptic, but how can we convince the world that this is the direction we go to? And there were 3 things at the top of that list, and I won't necessarily frame them as specific research questions, but basically it was we have to answer questions about the economics. When and how will this be economically viable, so we can pitch to policymakers, governments, etc., corporations, that this can happen in a feasible way and that we can feed the world. Where will the labor come from? If there's more labor for these practices, how will we navigate that? And where will the nitrogen come from? If half of our population is relying on synthetic fertilizer for their existence through the Green Revolution, and now we want to vastly decrease that amount of synthetic nitrogen, or for some people completely eliminate it, where will it come from? And that ties into the labor question and others.
Okay, thank you. I think great research questions. Researchers will hate that thing, compressed time to impact, but that's okay. Yeah, so please give a hand to these excellent panelists and the excellent ideas. Thank you. Thank you.